Welcome back, everyone, to Candid Conversations on Leadership.
Hi, Candice. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, Chris.
Fantastic. Who's our guest today?
Today, Jamelle Sharpe, Dean, Professor, and Guy Raymond Jones Faculty Scholar of the University of Illinois College of Law, has joined us as our special guest.
I'm so excited. Tell me about Dean Sharpe.
Professor Sharpe is a nationally recognized expert on federal administrative law and federal judiciary. His research focuses on the constitutional and statutory divisions of policymaking authority between courts and administrative agencies. Since joining the faculty in 2008, Professor Sharpe has held numerous academic leadership positions at the College of Law at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign campus and in the broader legal academia. For instance, he chaired the AALS Conflicts of Law section, was the chair-elect of the AALS Administrative Law, and served as the president of the University of Illinois Phi Beta Kappa's chapter. Professor Sharpe was selected for the University of Illinois' list of teachers ranked by excellent by their students for at least 20 times.
That's amazing.
Yes, Professor Sharpe received his JD from Yale Law School, where he was the managing editor of the Yale Journal of International Law. He graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from the New York University, where he earned his BA in English and American literature. During the 3 years prior to attending Yale Law School, Professor Sharpe was an analyst in the investment banking division of Morgan Stanley in New York. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
So tell us about your journey to becoming the dean at the College of Law here at the University of Illinois and what you've learned about leadership along the way.
Yeah, so it's really exciting. I'm glad that you guys are doing this podcast. It's a great topic. My leadership journey. I think that it's probably building it up to more than it actually is by calling it a journey. Maybe it's better described as accidental turns, trips, avoidance of potholes, and then being saved by my elders and betters along the way. But let's go into the Wayback Machine for a minute. Let me take us back to when I was an undergraduate student. I studied English and American literature. I loved it. I loved the study of words and the history of words and their clever usages and, painting a picture in a medium outside of the visual arts using words to do so. And when I was an undergraduate, I was actually thinking about going to grad school in literature as opposed to going to law school. But what I did know was that I needed to do a little bit of growing up, right? I was just mature enough to understand that I wasn't fully mature. And so I did the natural thing that literature majors do. Once I graduated, I went and I marketed and structured equity-linked securities at one of the world's leading investment banks, Morgan Stanley, on Wall Street. I wanted to do something that was hard, something that was really different, and something that would teach me accountability and responsibility. And boy, did it do that. So for 3 years, I did the normal, investment banking Wall Street analyst thing. I worked, 100 hours a week for 3 solid years. I remember once that I had worked 36 hours straight without a break. And I went home and it was a little disoriented, right? I was rooming with a buddy of mine from college at the time. And, I'm groggy and I kind of wake up a little bit and I see that it says 8 o'clock and I was like, oh no, I'm late for work. So I get up, I get dressed and I run out into the living room and there's my roommate. And I say, well, that's a little strange, right? And he's sitting there and he just kind of slowly turns and looks at me. And then I look at him and he's eating a bowl of soup. I was like, well, that's odd for breakfast. And then I look at the television and he's watching The Simpsons. I'm like, wait a minute. It was 8 p.m. I thought it was 8 a.m., right? Wow. That's how disorienting.
Your life was upside down.
Yeah, that was pretty disorienting. But, the experience taught me so much about working hard, about being accountable, about working in a team for a common purpose with people who are exceptionally bright and indefatigable, right? Just had motor for days, could work hours and hours on end. And, that was quite formative for me. In addition to that, right, not just, kind of the work ethic, the family that I'm first generation American. I'm first generation born in the United States. My family comes from a small West Indian island named St. Vincent. And there are more people in Champaign-Urbana than there are in that whole country, right? And so, when they came here, neither of them went to college. They had a real sense of working hard, being accountable to the people with whom you work, right? In the parlance of the West Indian family household, do things, quote unquote, properly, right? Which is to say, take ownership of it. When somebody assigns you something, it's yours. Pull it through to completion. Don't wait for somebody else to do it. Don't wait for somebody to give you what you need. You know what you need, you identify it to complete the job, and you go and get it yourself. But, right, and all those things have held me in good stead since then, particularly in this first work experience. But the thing that I wasn't prepared for was the difference between a career and a job. Right? So, my parents had jobs, right? They clock in, they clock out, right? My father was basically worked back office for what was Chemical Bank, was eventually acquired by Chase. And my mother was a nurse trained in England before she immigrated to the United States. But when they finished working, work was finished, right? It was for other people to manage the business and worry about that stuff. So that's the culture I grew up in. And, all of the, middle class folks I grew up around in New York, it was kind of the same thing. So I get to the investment bank, right? And like I said, that's not how they work. And so, I remember one day being at work, dog tired, and it's about dinner time. My mom calls me on the phone. So she says, "How's it going?" I say, "I'm dog tired." And her response, I'll never forget that. She's paused and then said, "Why don't you just go home?" Right? I'm like, that's nobody here. I was like, "Mom, that's just not a thing here, right? That's just not what we do." Making a short story pretty long. But the point is, that experience in the investment bank was formative to how I think about work and career. It was formative to my views on collaboration and teamwork, on putting ego aside and helping other people excel and be their best selves, and committing to a task or to a mission and getting in there with everybody else to make sure that we, get the mission accomplished, not just to get it done, but to get it done with excellence. And I've tried to, pull that through, right, since, the late 1990s when I was at the investment bank. And, it largely informs my views on leadership now, right? This is, formative stuff for me. It's foundational. I try to model that in the way that I interact with my colleagues. And, I try to help the students that I teach and I mentor to understand those lessons, because I think they hold them in good stead if they do.
Can you give me a couple examples of where collaboration and leadership came out in that investment banking environment? Because I think a lot of people might think of investment banking as this sort of lone wolf, full of individualism.
Yeah, Gordon Gekko-esque almost.
But you seem to think your experience seems to be that you learn collaboration and teamwork. So tell me a little bit about that.
The division of the investment bank in which I worked had very lean teams. And so you would have an analyst, right? These are folks who graduated from undergraduate, don't have their MBAs, right? That was my category. You might have an associate, somebody who just graduated and got their MBA. And then you would have the more senior bankers, right? A managing director or a principal, as they were called at that time. And that would be it. And, at the time, I was at Morgan Stanley, right? So we're talking about the late 1990s. We had at that point unprecedented volume of equity issuances, IPOs, and secondary offerings. There was literally more business than any reasonable person could handle with very lean staff. What does that mean? It means that the management structure had to be flat, because if you just had the person at the top who decided, well, my tea time is at 2:00, make sure all the work gets done and I'll see you in the morning, right? The firm is going to lose business. It'll lose business to Goldman Sachs. It'll lose business to what was then Merrill Lynch, right? Or Solomon Brothers, what was then Solomon Brothers, right? There are a lot of these places that aren't around anymore, right? Or at least not to the extent that they were. And so everybody, whether you had been in the business 5 minutes like me, or you had been in the business 25 years, like the more senior bankers, everybody had to pull together, and there was no job that was too menial to pursue the excellence that the firm had built its reputation on. The managing director with whom I was closest, it was a guy by the name of Mark Hantho, great guy, Canadian, had done investment banking all over the world. He had been in Tokyo, he had been in Hong Kong, he had been in London, right? And he had returned to New York to do these equity issuances. He said something to me that I have always remembered and is one of the core principles that I have in working with folks and in leading folks. He said, nobody owns a monopoly on good ideas. Nobody owns a monopoly on good ideas, right? And just the humility that implicit in that statement. Again, this is a guy he's been an investment banker at one of the world's most prestigious investment banks for like 20 years at that point. And his perspective, all that had basically taught him, right? Anybody could have a good idea and anybody should be able to share it. And we should all recognize it for what it is. It doesn't matter who it comes from. Let's focus on the idea and make sure the idea is what is privileged in our day-to-day work.
In knowing that, in living that is probably what made him as successful as it did.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly. In addition to being a great guy.
Yeah.
So what inspired you to focus on federal administrative law?
So how do I make that transition? So, I decided, the investment banking experience was really good, but, I wanted to do something that I guess married three instincts or interests that I had. One, I had never let go of just the interest in text and words, right? The innate, the pleasure of the text, as it were, right? I wanted to do something that was civically oriented. You can, my view, right? You can work to build personal wealth, generational wealth for your family. And, I think that's a perfectly respectable, right? It can be even a noble pursuit. I wanted to spend my professional energies in something that contributed in some way to publicly generated goods. And I wanted to be able to do that in a very practical way. And so I decided to go to law school rather than continue on at the investment bank or go off and get my MBA, right? And my interest in this subject got piqued while I was in law school. So I'm going to go law nerd for a minute.
Great.
That's okay.
Love it.
Is that
Love
the
it.
space
We're
we're
ready.
in?
We're okay.
Dive in.
Can we do that?
Yeah, dive in.
Right. Can we go right into the deep end? From my perspective, law, right? And I think social sciences perhaps more generally, but law certainly is foundational to human flourishing. I think it is foundational. I think it is indispensable. And, frankly, I don't think that this fact is as appreciated as it should be. Law is what makes complex human collaboration possible. It's what makes it durable, right? In order to cure cancer, in order to put a person on Mars, in order to build a computer with quantum level processing power, you need a society that is sufficiently stable for a sufficiently long period of time, and that is capable of facilitating human collaboration of incredible complexity while navigating different interests and ideas and motivations. And like I said, and you need to be able to do this over an extended period of time. The thing that does that for us as human beings is law and legal institutions. So from my perspective, in order for, right, the very fine folks in the north end of our campus, right, in the experimental and the applied sciences and the theoretical sciences to do the great things they do, we at the southern end of campus in the law school need to teach people to do the things that we do, because we're the ones who provide the conditions that allow them to make our lives better, more livable. Administrative law, which for those of the listeners who
Yes.
may not know what that is, right? Everybody should know what administrative law is, right? Administrative law, in a nutshell, is the constitutional and statutory law that creates, guides and controls the federal administrative state, right? And so when you're talking about the Environmental Protection Agency, when you're talking about NASA, when you're talking about the Post Office, when you're talking about the Department of Defense, administrative law is the law that tells those agencies what powers they're allowed to have. It tells those agencies how they're allowed to use those powers. And it tells the elected officials and the courts how to control the use of those powers. And so if you're interested in how society is constructed, right, to generate human flourishing, to generate these complex collaborations over time, the federal administrative state is the mechanism by which we implement that system. And administrative law is the constitutional and statutory law that structures it. And so because it marries so many of the things that I'm interested in, the text, the civic mindedness, and right the construction of societal collaboration and human flourishing all in one discipline, I think it is, as you could probably tell, the most fascinating thing that somebody could study.
You hit the jackpot.
Yes.
So tell me, how does that federal administrative law intersect with higher education? And I think in some ways we're seeing this very much in the spotlight today.
Yes, we are.
In spring of 2025.
Yes.
So how does that all work together?
I think of, and this is the way that I describe the administrative state to my students, right? And again, I'm going to date myself here, but that's okay, right? I'm a child of the 80s or 90s. It's a great time to grow up. I liken the administrative state to the Matrix. So when Morpheus is describing the Matrix to Neo, right? What does he say? It's there when you wake up in the morning. It's there when you pay your taxes, right? It is ubiquitous. It is pervasive. That is basically what the administrative state is, right? Especially since the early 1930s, the administrative state touches on just about every area of human endeavor in the United States. That would include higher education in multiple ways. And so whether we're talking about federal student loan programs, whether we're talking about research funding, right? Because, for decades, the biggest supporter of university level research has been the federal government. Those research programs, right? The disbursement of those dollars, the identification of the research projects that are going to be funded, that comes out of administrative agencies, which are then governed and controlled by administrative law. And so just about, almost every area that you can think of in higher education is touched directly or indirectly by the administrative state. And, what we're seeing now is an attempt to massively reorient the purpose and effect of the federal government. And here we're talking specifically about the executive branch, right? The Article 2 people, right? Under the constitutional schema. There has always been, and when I say always, I mean always, since the kernel of the idea of the American experiment formed in someone's head, this debate about what government should be doing, right? Right. And, the political scientists really kind of, get grumpy when law folks start talking about political theory, but hey, put it in the comment section. So here, right.
As a political science undergrad, I'm interested to hear what you're saying.
Here we go. Right.
Yeah.
So let's kind of divide the world very, very crudely, right? About governmental purpose, right? So, on the one hand, right, you can have the idea that the best thing that government can do is provide for the minimal conditions that allow people to write their own stories for self-determination, right? Things like infrastructure, martial defense, right? Foreign policy, right? To ensure that we have good relations with our neighbors and can marshal the adequate defenses when those diplomatic efforts break down. Another way to look at this is, well, government should do for people what they cannot do for themselves, right? And so, often in the law, the way that we kind of describe this is, right, in talking about the Constitution specifically, do we have a Constitution of negative rights, or can the Constitution be viewed as a document that actually creates positive rights, right? Negative rights, right, again, very loosely, the right to be free from government, right? The best thing that government can do is provide for the minimum conditions and otherwise get out of your way and stay out of your life. Or should the government actually be more proactive and more involved in the lives of individuals so as to ensure that they have some minimal level of human flourishing? This is not a new debate. This is a seminal originating debate. Mm-hmm. And you see that today in the debates about the power of the federal administrative state, the size of government, the activities that the government should be engaged in, the extent to which government should be involved, not only in providing benefits to people so that they have a minimum level of sustenance, but also the extent that they should be involved in regulating social and economic activity in the private sector. And so we're seeing an attempt at a radical reorientation, right, towards something more akin to that first category, a more minimalist government, right, that doesn't make choices. We rely on private ordering, rely on markets, right, rely on individual decision-making with minimal interference, help, depending on the word that you use, right? That's an inflected word, right? It's like, depends on your perspective is which of those words that you choose to describe it with people's everyday lives, right? And so, we're seeing that in these attempts to shut down governmental agencies. We're seeing this in current attempts by the president to gain greater control over the administrative state that is left, right? After, if these attempts are successful. And to varying degrees, this is something that presidents since Franklin Delano Roosevelt have attempted, right? Each president has tried in different ways to exert more control over the federal administrative state. And in so doing, have exhibited, their underlying priors about what the role of government should be, right? And so now we have another chapter in that story, one that, at least so far, it's been a wild ride, let me tell you.
I've been following along because I've been seeing snippets and articles of various ways we've been quoted in news articles about reduction in program funding and things like that. However, I'm going to transition to a question about what you feel is essential for an effective leader, because I can go on and on about all of the federal
we could dive deep into this for hours, but we want to get back to the focus on leadership.
What qualities do you believe are essential to effective leadership, and why?
I think there are a couple of things. So the first is honesty, and I would actually say radical honesty. So what does that even mean?
Tell me more.
Yeah. I think that a leader needs to be honest with the people they lead. People need to know that you mean what you say and that they can rely on what you're telling them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're right every time, but you have to be able to, you have to do your homework, know what you're talking about before you open your mouth, right? And people need to know that when they ask you a question, you're telling them as much as you can, and what you're telling them substantively is, from your point of view, accurate. But in addition to that, and this is where the radical honesty point comes in, right? You also have to be very honest with yourself about the things that you do well, the things you don't do well, the things that you're afraid of, the things that you would prefer people not know, right? About a situation, about you, so that you can be more intentional in the way that you lead, in the way that you interact with the members of your team, right? You have to know yourself well, and that takes a little bit of courage and a little bit of honesty, right? It's like, and again, kind of circling back to my time as a literature major, I think that the best writers, the best authors, novelists, poets, playwrights, they exhibit a level of radical honesty about who they are that would frighten most people. They can explore, the aspects of themselves that they really don't like and other people may not like. And not only do they explore that, they do it publicly, right? And it might take a little bit of interpretation to be able to tie that back to their work. But, what I found, at least in my studies, is that it often is reflected, right? It's an exploration of their own, individualism, including the parts that they don't like. So honesty, I think, is incredibly important. Truth, right, as a related concept is really important, right? I like to think of myself as a truth over tribe kind of guy. And so this is something that, I teach my children. It's something that I try to model with my coworkers. It's something that I try to impart to my students, that we should never be afraid of what the right answer is. And, we don't shade the story simply because our quote unquote team would prefer that the story read in a particular way, right? Now, you always pursue the truth. You have to be sensible about how you present it to people. You can't be callous. How many times have you met a person who, let's just say they are tact challenged, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And then when they are called on that, what is their response? Well, I'm just honest. It's like, well, you are that, yes, right? Right. But you could both be honest and undiplomatic, right?
Yeah.
And so, but not being afraid of the truth, even to the people who are closest to you, even when there are people who are invested in shading it. And then the last thing that I would say, principle-wise as a leader is, I genuinely believe in the service leadership model. I am not doing my job if the people that I am leading don't flourish and excel. What I tell my folks is my goal is to develop you as a professional and to make you so valuable that I'm not going to be able to keep you anymore. As a leader, right, I know that I'm being successful if the people who report up to me are being successful. I know that I'm being successful if I am being proactive and thinking about things that they can do to make their careers more valuable. Your career should be an appreciating asset. It's something that you should be able to remodel and rebuild and market and be able to sell to your benefit. And if I'm not actively thinking about ways to help them do that, I'm not doing my job. And so, my success, I think, as a leader, which, by virtue of me saying this, you can see my principles. My success as a leader is measured in the success of the people I lead, not in anything that I directly contribute to the enterprise.
I love that. And so with the success being on the measure of what others have done, I want to give you time to share some of the accolades or achievements that those at the College of Law are doing. So What are you proud of? What significant things have they done that you would like to share?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I always welcome the opportunity to brag on behalf of my colleagues. The College of Law is an incredible institution, right? I'm proud to be the 14th dean of the college. And, as you guys may know, I'm also the first African-American dean in the history of the college. And part of what makes the college great, like any other human institutions, it's not the bricks and mortar, it's the people. And, I am genuinely lucky to have what I would say is the best group of colleagues, administrators, faculty, and staff on this whole campus. We have very low turnover. We do a very good job of incorporating new people. People are attracted to working at the College of Law because they know the culture that we have there. And so, with respect to, particular things that I'm proud of, that my colleagues have accomplished, there are many, but let me try to narrow it down. The first is that we admit some of the finest law students in the country every year, right? In each of the last several years, right? And this goes back to, my excellent predecessor, Vikram Amar, who was dean before I was. Every year, the academic credentials of the students that we admit improve year over year. And we have some of the very finest students in the entire country. We just admitted, right, the class that started this year was, with respect to traditional academic credentials, the very best class we have ever admitted. Our students come from 28 different states and 30 different countries. We are a deeply international and inclusive student body and community. And those things don't happen on their own, right? Our dean of admissions and our director for inclusive excellence and the members of the student services staff, right? Their intelligence, their thoughtfulness, and their dedication to the community are what make those accomplishments possible. If you go to law school, presumably you want a job after you graduate. Would be nice, right? To be able to pay the bills and eat. Again, this year we have the highest placement rate for our students who graduated last year in the history of the college. We're up at, I think, about 98%.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Of our JD students.
That's very difficult to do.
It is very hard in a very competitive market where you have a lot of law schools in the state and in the region, right? Most of the graduates of those law schools wanting to go to a single market, which is Chicago. And we were still able to do that, right? That is a remarkable achievement, right? So, our career placement folks have done an amazing job. We've been very successful in faculty recruiting, right? The University of Illinois is an amazing institution, like I said before, but it's geographically isolated. And so, it's a great college town, but it can be difficult to recruit people here, right? My colleagues on our hiring committee have done an excellent job recruiting top flight faculty over the last couple of years since I've been dean. Whereas before that, we had some challenges in that area. We have built up significant momentum through their efforts, right? And I could go on. Our practical training for lawyers, right? We have a wonderful program called the Anderson Center that trains litigators. And, it's amazing. And it's now nationally ranked, whereas before it wasn't ranked at all. And this is in the last couple of years. I am privileged to be able to contribute encouragement, guidance, and support, right? To basically allow my colleagues to be their best selves and to really excel and do what they do best.
So that kind of success doesn't come accidentally. And in what we do as individuals to take care of ourselves is really important. And so what kind of personal habits or routines do you have that contribute to your success?
The first thing that I would say is, right, the fact that I am ambulatory, the fact that I can walk around and do the things I do is attributable mostly to my darling wife, who is also a professor at the law school, Jamelle Sharpe. And so, my primary habit is basically doing what she tells me to do.
That's a good habit.
It's good to have a partner that motivates you.
Yes. Right. Something that I have learned, and I could probably say more often, especially as my 20th wedding anniversary is tomorrow. So, family, making sure that I spend time with family is important. One thing that I'll say, one very concrete thing that I'm sure that you have heard from other people, or at least those who study leadership have certainly heard. So, I'm not going to go and collect my Nobel for coming up with this idea. I make my bed every morning. Mm-hmm. I make my bed every morning, right? And why do I do that? It gives me time to reflect the repetition and the work of making something symmetrical, right? Making it presentable allows me time to kind of reflect this mechanical, right? So I can get some physical activity, which helps, right, the brain get going. That routinizes my day. It helps me start my day with purpose, with activity. And so it helps me to frame everything else that I'm going to do that day and to really get a running start. And then, there are the guilty pleasures, a big Marvel fan. So, you got to watch, Daredevil on Netflix. I mean, you got to, mostly on airplanes now, but when I'm traveling. But, I've been, a big fan of, fiction generally, but, comic book fiction in particular, since I was, a wee lad growing up in the Bronx. So, there are things that I do to maintain mental health and an even keel and help me gain the right perspective, to focus on the right things, to remain optimistic even when things are hard. What I like to tell my people, optimism populates my option set. Pessimism takes things out of the option set. And so we got to be optimistic. We always have to believe there's something else that we could do, should be doing, must be doing. And so, the things that help maintain that perspective, are things that I try to invest my time in when I have the time.
I love that concept about optimism. I've never thought of it that way. I consider myself an optimist, but I never really thought about how it opens your mind to more possibility, for sure.
So as an aside, favorite superhero character?
Oh, the favorite superhero. Oh boy. Oh, it's Batman. I mean, is this really, right?
That's a check.
Yeah.
So what do you see as the future for legal education, and how is the College of Law preparing for that?
The future of legal education, I think, obviously, is going to follow the future of the practice. And so, we look at the things that are influencing, the practice of law, the challenges that we see in the practice of law. And, we try to be responsive so that when we train new lawyers, they can hit the ground running and not just survive the system of which they're going to be a part, but lead it. And so there are a couple of things I think that immediately come to mind. One is technology. Okay, so, right, artificial intelligence, large language models, if I'm getting the LLM right.
Yeah, you are.
Okay, terrific. And the extent to which they are going to interact with the representation of clients. Now, I'm not a betting man, right? That's why I've only been to Vegas twice in my life. But if I had to bet, there are things that human beings do well. There are things that machines do well. And I, for one, don't believe that we need to worry about the machines doing well, the things that the human beings do well in the short to medium term, right? Identifying what those things are and assigning tasks, particularly in the legal profession, accordingly, right, I think is the sensible way to kind of deal with that problem.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, substituting, the human touch, human ingenuity is not something I think that we need to worry about. But using these new tools to make the practice of law more efficient, more consistent, perhaps more thoughtful, I think is absolutely critical. The law school is responding to this in several ways, increasing the curriculum, the training around legal technology. We recently relaunched our law and technology program to be an innovation law and technology program, right, to encapsulate the research around this. And this is the research in the technology. This is research on how the technology affects the law, and it's research into the ethics of using this technology as a lawyer, right, in different ways, right, in life sciences, in, computer science, et cetera, and investing in faculty hires that will put Illinois right alongside the very finest institutions in the country. So when you want the finest thinking about law and technology, you immediately think of us. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I wonder whether law is going to follow the medicine model. There's a dearth, and there has been for a long time, of fully qualified doctors in the United States, and there are a lot of reasons for that. And so one thing that the medical profession has done is to empower and credential non-doctor health professionals to provide an increasing number of types of healthcare, right? So you now have physician's assistants, you have nurse practitioners, you've always had nurses. As I had mentioned before, my mother was a nurse before she retired, trained in England before she came to the United States. I wonder whether law is going to go in the same direction, right? Currently, you have to be a fully licensed lawyer in order to provide legal services. You have, folks who support lawyers, but as far as representing clients in a legal proceeding, as far as enforcing, representing clients in drafting contracts that can then be enforced, right, unfortunately, but probably in a legal proceeding that follows it, you need, you need to be licensed, take the bar exam and be licensed. The problem with that is we have a lot of legal deserts in the United States. We have a lot of them in the state, right? We hear this all the time from our alums in central and southern Illinois. You have, counties where you either have no lawyers at all, or you have one lawyer, right, who wanted to retire 10 years ago, but they have nobody to hand their practice over to. And so I wonder whether at some point the law will start empowering non-JD legal practitioners, folks who have, for example, 1-year degrees, who can draft simple wills and estate plans, who can draft simple contracts, who can draft constitutive documents to create a corporation or a limited liability company. Because currently, there are folks in many parts of this state and in parts of the country who could definitely benefit from those legal services, but they can't get a lawyer, right? And so one solution to that might be to empower other folks to be able to provide those services. And so the law school is looking at, not necessarily in anticipation of that. I don't know when that'll happen, if ever, right? But we have various degree programs that calibrate the amount of legal learning that people want to the professional purpose to which they might put it. Not everybody who wants to learn about the law wants to be Matlock and stand up in court, right, and find the bad guy in front of a jury.
Right, yeah. So you mentioned earlier this concept of truth over tribe.
Yes.
And a lot of times finding that truth requires us to be really open to feedback from others.
Yes.
And so can you give an example of feedback that you received that was tough to hear but ultimately made you better?
Okay. So I will cabin my response to outside of the marital context. So nothing that which is probably the best criticism, the most useful, but speaking professionally only, the best feedback that I got that I didn't want to hear came from somebody who, quite frankly, I didn't like very much. And this is one of my supervisors going back to my investment banking time. This is one of my supervisors at the investment bank who said to me once that he said, you got to pay more attention to detail. Literature is a wonderful thing to study, and it's intellectually rigorous, and it's ennobling, right, as a human being, right, to connect with other people's experiences, right? It's like, why do we read? So we know we're not alone. There are all sorts of things that you get out of it, right? That is, really amazing. Dotting I's and crossing T's is not necessarily one of those things. And so, the investment banking context is a pressure cooker. You could lose a $20, $30, $40 million deal because the I didn't get dotted and the T did not get crossed. He said to me very bluntly, because, this is in, the first few weeks that I was at the investment bank. He basically told me, you're not dotting your I's and crossing your T's. You have to pay more attention to detail. This is something that was hard to hear because I'd always thought of myself as a highly competent person, somebody who was well-intentioned, somebody who, really took their craft seriously, took responsibility seriously, and I wasn't carrying my responsibility. I had to own that, and I had to live with it. When I was litigating, some of us at the firm at which I worked after graduating from law school had a saying, wrong in small things, wrong in all things. If you can't get the small stuff right, how can I trust you to get the big stuff right? Right? Do your job. Do it well. And then we'll trust you to do the harder stuff. For me, I learned that not when I was at the firm. I learned that years before when I was at the investment bank. Right? And no, it wasn't easy to hear, but it was true. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I've heard a lot of inspiring things as someone that took the LSAT or other things and thought about maybe law. Is there advice that you can give to those aspiring leaders that want to go into the field of law? Do you have advice for our listeners or watchers?
I think that law is a noble profession. I genuinely believe that. I think that before you go to law school, though, you should do the work of understanding what lawyers do on a day-to-day basis, okay? And so I say lawyers because you can do almost anything with a law degree, right? We see that, right? You see leaders in business, you see leaders in government, screenwriters, right? You see all sorts of folks, right? Diplomats who aren't practicing attorneys, but the analytical rigor that is required of you in the course of studying law holds you in good stead in many non-scientific, let's say, professions, okay? But if you're going to go to law school, you should at least be entertaining the idea of being a practicing attorney, as opposed to doing some of these other things that attorneys do with their law degrees, and do the work of talking to lawyers. I will tell you, I find it very hard to look at legal dramas because they bear little verisimilitude to the practice of law, right? And even if they did, right? A lot of the law that these dramas focus on, it could be television dramas or movies or whatever, they are either focused on a very narrow conception of what legal practice is, right? You have, folks who are in the courtroom all the time. That's true of some lawyers. It's very not true of a lot of lawyers who are litigators. Most of what they do is get parties to settle out of court rather than going to court. And then, these high-powered transactional attorneys who are doing, M&A deals for multi-billion-dollar multinational corporations. Sure, there are lawyers who do that. Let me tell you, most don't, right? So do the homework of finding folks to see the amazing breadth of how you can live your life in the law. Try to get a granular understanding. It's like, okay, what do I do in the days that end in Y, right? What does the actual practice look like on a day-to-day basis? And then you can make a much more informed decision about whether this is the right path for you. Law school is hard, okay? Right? There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It is, especially initially, it is disorienting because what we are doing, mostly on purpose, some because just because it's fun, we are reframing how people think, how they communicate, the precision with which they communicate, and the precision with which they listen to what other people say to them. What I like to tell first years is you will now be the least popular person at that Thanksgiving dinner because after we're done with you, you can't have a casual conversation with Uncle Joe. He says one thing, you have 15 questions in response, right? But if you're going to go through that kind of intellectual reorientation for 3 years, at least entertain the possibility of being a day-to-day lawyer and give yourself as much solid information about what that might be like for you as you can.
This podcast is called Candid Conversations.
Yeah.
And so we always ask near the end, what's something that most people don't know about you?
Aside from my my love for comic books, let's see. I'm a pretty simple guy, right? There's not a whole lot to me to be frank. Something that folks don't know. I would say that I have been an avid gamer in my pre-Dean life. Right, since I had ColecoVision back in the early 1980s, right, all through the Nintendo Entertainment System, right, the Super Nintendo, right, the TurboGrafx 16. For those listeners who are familiar with that system, it was underrated. It was a great system. Never got a fair shot in the United States. But the thing that I love and my favorite type of game is the single player RPG. Not this online stuff, right? That's for like my son, right? He plays Fortnite and I look at it as like, I don't even know what you're doing here. But I love there are two aspects of it that I love. One is the story. I love being immersed in a compelling story. And the second thing is I love building a character to strength. It kind of dovetails with my love of teaching, right? Taking people from point A and challenging them to get to point B, where they're a lot stronger and different, more moral, more capable, more empathetic at the end of their journey than they were at the beginning of their journey. And the RPG game format, I think, if it's done well, right, is one of the best expressions of that idea.
So if I could put any console, any game in your hands that would make you feel the most nostalgic in this moment, what would it be?
Okay, so I'm going to give you a controversial choice because it's part of a trilogy and it's not the part of the trilogy that most people love. It's Mass Effect 3.
Okay.
It's not Mass Effect 2. Mass Effect 2 is the one that everybody says is the best game. Mass Effect 3, because it's the culmination of Commander Shepard's story and there have to be hard choices and not everybody survives to the end, right? To me, that is, the culmination, I think, of, one of the greatest character arcs in all of gaming.
So we have a lot of gamers, I believe, in our audience.
Yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to the debate in the comments.
I'm just like, I'm going to see that's going to spark something. I have learned, thank you so much for joining us today. I've learned so much. I feel this has been like a very engaged class at one point. I've learned so much. What do you hope our listeners and viewers take away from this conversation ultimately?
I think that this university is a genuine gem. You know, having grown up on the East Coast, right? I only knew about the U of I because I used to watch the basketball, the Fighting Illini on Saturday mornings on CBS, right? The men's basketball team. But I didn't really know much about the university, its amazing history, the numerous contributions that it has made to just about every field of human endeavor over the course of many decades. So, you know, one thing that I hope, aside from, you know, whatever I said about, you know, leadership, about federal administrative law, or about the practice of law, that people get a sense that if they don't know about the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, they really should, right? Their knowledge about outstanding leading institutions in American life is incomplete if they don't know about this university. So that's one thing. I hope it sparks an interest to learn more. And the second thing is live your life with principle. Know what they are, interrogate them actively, and let them guide your decisions. And don't be afraid to stand up in a room and say something if you actually believe it. This is part of the honesty point. If you actually believe something, stand up and say it. Don't be afraid to be told you're wrong. You should want to correct a wrong idea in your head. But if you really, really believe something, you shouldn't be ashamed to share that something with other people and to be guided by it. And then the last thing I would say is I hope people take away the importance of helping others be their best selves and measuring your success by their prosperity and not necessarily by yours.
Thank you. I want to parallel Candice's comments about this feeling like a class. There was a moment during this podcast where I was like, maybe I should sign up for law school just so I could come and take your class. Really inspiring conversation. And we thank you so much, Dean Sharpe, for your time today.
Thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. It was a pleasure to speak with you both.
Okay. Thank you.